Welcome to the show, everyone, and thank you for tuning in. Before we begin today's episode, I want to say a massive thank you to our newest supporters on Patreon and on buymeacoffee.com. Thank you to Lydia, Shannon Lee, and Carl. Without your support and generosity, this podcast would not be possible, and we truly appreciate your help. For a full list of our wonderful supporters, please see the show notes. With that being said, let's get ready and start the show. In 2019, the United States Navy finally admitted that UFOs not only exist, but that they have been tracking and studying them for years, and they are now referring to them as UAPs, also known as Unidentified Aerial Phenomena. While this admission came as no surprise to many of us, it was validation for thousands of people across the country who had been previously told by authorities that UFOs aren't real. But for many people around the world, the painfully slow pace at which many governments divulge declassified information is too little, too late, and the stories in today's episode are, in my opinion, striking examples of blatant cover-ups involving some very bizarre incidents, some of which are becoming more well-known because of information that has surfaced within the last couple of decades, which leads me to our first story, known most prominently as the Westall UFO Incident.
The first time it happened, I was sleeping and woke up because I felt a hand on my leg and I realized that I couldn't move.
And he come across this object on the ground which was the shape of a flying saucer. So he jumped out of his pickup and went down there, and there was 4 beings laying on the ground.
When I raised my head back up, I was turning my head, and out of my peripheral vision I seen something hop to a tree. And it was tall, about 7-8 foot tall, and it was black, real hairy, like a gorilla.
Welcome to the Paranormal Mysteries Podcast, and thank you for being here. I'm your host, Nick Ryan. April 6, 1966, was a typical Wednesday at Westall High School, now known as Westall Secondary College, in Melbourne, Victoria, Australia. Students and teachers were busy going about their day in the usual manner, but something was about to take place outside of the school grounds that was rather unusual indeed. At approximately 11 a.m., a class of students and a teacher from Westall High School were just completing a sports activity outside, when an object, described as being a gray, saucer-shaped craft with a slight purple hue, and being about twice the size of a family car, was alleged to have been seen. According to witnesses, the object was descending, and then crossed and overflew the high school's southwest corner, going in a southeasterly direction, before disappearing from sight, as it descended behind a stand of trees and into a paddock known as the Grange, which is just southwest of the school. The children at the school were of course mesmerized, as were the teachers on duty, so they jumped the fence towards the wooded area where the UFO had disappeared behind, as the teachers told them to return. According to a witness, one of the girls made it over to where the UFO had landed while it was still there, and was found unconscious, and had to be taken away in an ambulance. According to the same witness, she never returned to school after that day. Before most of the eyewitnesses could reach where the UFO had landed, it apparently rose up and took off at what they all said was incredible speeds. When it was all said and done, a mixture of approximately 300 students and teachers had witnessed the bizarre aerial phenomena, and the entire ordeal was said to have lasted about 20 minutes. The children were all told to go back to the school and head to their respective classes while the police showed up. The police came and talked to a few of the adult witnesses, and then the headmaster of the school called an unscheduled assembly to discuss what had happened and to tell the students that what they saw was not an extraterrestrial craft, but something man-made, such as a weather balloon, and told them not to repeat what they had seen that day to anyone. At the same time, the other teachers at the school reported that 2 men in dark blue suits had come and talked to them about what they saw. They were also told not to discuss what they saw that day, especially to the press. One of the teachers, who had grabbed her camera and snapped dozens of pictures of the saucer-shaped object, said that when she was taken aside by the men in suits, they took her camera and said it was now their property. She also said that the men were from the ASIO, the Australian Security Intelligence Organization. Science teacher Andrew Greenwood was later visited by officers at his home, who threatened him not to discuss any of what he witnessed under the Official Secrets Act. They said that if he did, they would have him fired and discredit him by releasing rumors of him being an alcoholic, which he wasn't. Oddly, at the time not much was reported on the incident, despite the sheer number of witnesses. It was mentioned in only a few brief articles in the Dandenong Journal and The Age, which wrote it off as a weather balloon, and that was that. There were UFO researchers and journalists who tried to get more information, but strangely, most of the witnesses were uncooperative and reluctant to talk about it, some of them outright refusing to meet with interviewers, most likely due to them being bullied and told not to do so by the authorities. On top of this, school authorities apparently did their best to deny access to the witnesses in the first place, and it seemed as if there was an agenda to brush it all under the carpet. However, over the years, more and more of the people who saw the strange sight began to open up about it. As more witnesses have come forward, a clearer picture has begun to emerge about what happened that day. It would be discovered that some witnesses had actually seen more than one of the objects, and that it seemed as if military craft had been witnessed chasing and trying to engage the UFOs. Although no records could be found of any aircraft scheduled to be in the area, either commercial or military, the eyewitnesses stand by their story. It was also found that the UFO had left a mark in the ground, which appeared as a circle of yellowed grass with a swirly pattern, and that some witnesses had seen official-looking men in blue uniforms inspecting this mark. One of the most interesting pieces of the puzzle uncovered was during an interview with one of the witnesses at the time, science teacher Andrew Greenwood. An Australian UFO researcher and photographer, James J. Kibble, conducted an interview with Greenwood, and the recording was then sent to an American physicist, Dr. James E. McDonald, who is well known for his research into UFOs. The audio was discovered among McDonald's possessions, leading to the common misconception that it is Dr. McDonald speaking on the recording, when really it is Mr. Kibble. Mr. Kibble recorded himself describing his and Greenwood's meeting, and the creepy details Mr. Greenwood gave him about his experience. This is an excerpt from that recording. Kibble says, "Greenwood told me that the UFO was first brought to his attention by a hysterical child who ran into his classroom and told him there's a flying saucer outside. He thought this child had become deranged or something, so he didn't take any notice. But when the child insisted that this object was in the sky, he decided to go out and have a look for himself. He called it the most amazing flying he had ever seen in his life. There appeared to be military planes that were doing everything possible to approach the object, and he said how they all avoided a collision, he will never know. Every time they got too close to the object, it would slowly accelerate, then rapidly accelerate, and then move away from them and stop. Then they would take off after it again, and the same thing would happen." Greenwood would explain that the whole spectacle had lasted around 20 minutes, and that shortly after, the headmaster had warned the faculty and students not to talk about what they had seen with anyone, even going so far as to threaten to fire or expel anyone who did. Some even spoke of some sort of military-looking figures lurking about. According to him, this was enough to get many of the witnesses to shut up about it all, and is one of the main reasons the whole story just sort of fell off the media's radar, only being unearthed years later. Yet even now, decades later, the witnesses have stuck to their stories and insist on what they saw, leaving us to try and figure out what it could have been. Mr. Kibble's description of his interview with Mr. Greenwood offers a rare insight into the events from the eyes of someone who was an adult at the time. There continues to be speculation over what actually happened, and the site of the encounter has been turned into a memorial park to reflect the 1966 Westall UFO Incident. I originally wanted to share Mr. Kibble's recording with you at the end of tonight's episode, but after much deliberation, I've decided not to. In my opinion, the audio quality is just too poor and too hard to understand, which makes the recording more frustrating than informative. I have, however, included a link to it in the show notes. Instead, I would like to play a portion of a Studio 10 broadcast from January 20th, 2016, in which the hosts interview 3 of the eyewitnesses and 1 UFO investigator. All 3 of the witnesses were attending Westall High School in 1966, and they discuss their first-hand experiences that remain vivid even to this day. Have a listen.
And joining us now, 3 of the people who were there when they were school children all those years ago. In Melbourne, Joy Clark and Terry Peck, and in Brisbane, Jackie Argent, and also with us in Canberra, principal researcher for this UFO incident, Shane Ryan. Good morning. Let's begin with Joy and Terry in Melbourne. Can you tell us what you saw?
Yes, Natasha. I was out playing cricket on the oval at the time, and we noticed these 3 craft hovering above the school, which was a bit unusual. They definitely weren't aircraft. And then after about 10 minutes, we saw one go down into an area behind our school called the Grange, where we used to do our cross-country runs. So being a little bit of a rebel, as I was at school, I was one of the first to run through and jump over the fence and arrive at the Grange, and it was on the ground in front of me. The other 2 girls had arrived before me, and one was hysterical, Tanya, and the other girl had fainted. So I just looked at it, and after a few minutes it just raised up above me, probably to about 12 feet, turned on its side and went zoom straight up into the air and disappeared almost instantly. And there were 2 other craft in the air at the time.
Joy, did you see something similar, and what were you thinking it was at that stage? Were you convinced it was a UFO?
Look, I didn't know what it was.
Yes, definitely a UFO. I was actually in science class, and we had a student had rung in and flung the door open and said, Mr. Greenwood, there's things in the sky, there's flying saucers in the sky. So we all ran down the corridor and out onto the oval, and yes, there were flying saucers in the sky. I saw 3 of them, but it took me quite a while to sort of comprehend what I was looking at, because I'd never seen anything like that before.
Jackie, it's quite intriguing. Did you also see those flying saucers?
I saw a flying saucer. I don't recall there being more than one. But we were down the back. I was down the back of the oval with Tanya when we noticed it in the sky. It did some manoeuvres which were very strange, which is why our attention was drawn to it in the first place. And then it came down over the Grange. We could see it coming down, so we took off after it. Tanya actually reached the craft, I believe. I didn't, because she came back screaming towards me, and then I ran back with her to the school. She got taken away in an ambulance, and that was the last time I saw her.
And can you tell us a bit more about these craft? What colour were they? How big were they? Did they actually land, or were they just hovering above the ground?
The craft I saw was silver in colour. It was round. It did come down on the ground. Even though I didn't see it on the ground, I saw the marks that it left later on that day. It could move incredibly fast, and it could also appear to stand still. When it took off from the other aircraft that were buzzing it, it made them look as though they were at standstill.
Right. And Shane, skeptics have dismissed the event as just the product of the fertile imagination of children. What's your response to that?
Some skeptics have, and there are other skeptics, I think, who take a more serious look at a story like this, a story which has so much witness testimony. I'd like to begin by paying tribute to Joy and Terry and Jackie and all the other witnesses who have been brave enough to come forward and talk about this story. 96 witnesses so far have been happy to talk to me about the flying saucer that they saw. 147 people have come forward and spoken to me about the circles in the paddocks that were left behind by the flying saucer. So if you just look at those numbers alone, you realise we're looking at something pretty important. Now, remember, when we talk about UFOs, obviously in the general social consciousness, people think about extraterrestrial craft. UFOs simply means unidentified flying objects. We don't know what an extraterrestrial spaceship, for example, would look like. Now, it just simply means something that was seen in the sky that nobody could easily identify. And I think we have to begin with that. Now, as interesting as a program as the X-Files is, and absolutely it is, I think this is a UFO story that all Australians need to know about, need to take seriously.
Can I ask what happened to the girl? You took her back to the school, the one that was hysterical. Is it Tanya? Mm. And she went into the hospital, and then you went to visit her at her place, and they said she didn't live there.
That's yes, right. I went to her house the following day, and an English-speaking woman opened the door and said there had never been a Tanya living there. Now, the problem with that is that Tanya's parents didn't speak English to start with. I think they were Yugoslavian. So I'd been to this house a lot of times and then was told, no, sorry, you're mistaken.
Oh, my God, that's
So what's happened to her? Do you know if she disappeared? Have you had any contact with her? Do you know where she is and what happened?
I have had no personal contact with her. I know one of the researchers has. She prefers to stay anonymous and not be involved in anything at all. She told the researcher that she had no recall of what had happened. And then there was a very odd story about her parents putting her in a convent for some reason that was, to me, totally ridiculous. That's it.
Terry, we've seen drawings that look like a flying saucer and even two flying saucers. Can you describe for us what was there?
Yes, it was about 1.5 times the size of a normal family sedan, and it was round, silver coloured. There were all lights around the bottom of it, no windows. It threw off a bit of a heat, and it was making a low buzzing sound.
Did any of you at all witness anyone inside these unidentified flying objects? Did you see anyone?
No.
No.
Joy, to you firstly, now you were interviewed by journalists, reporters at the time. What has happened to your story since then, and do you think there has been a cover-up?
Oh, absolutely. That film, I was interviewed by Channel 9 and out the front of the school, and a man walked up to me. He was in blue, so he may have been Air Force or perhaps police, I'm not sure. Put his hand on my shoulder and told me to stop talking and go back into the school, and then turned around to the the cameraman and the reporter and told them both to go away. But previous to that happening, not long after the sighting, the army arrived opposite the school in 3 jeeps and jumped out of the back, and they were in camouflage gear and all that sort of stuff. So they were sort of out the school for quite a while. And then we had a special assembly. We were all called to a special assembly and told that we hadn't seen anything. It was a weather balloon. We're all massively hysterical. Don't talk about it. If you talk about it, you'll get into trouble. And I got detention because I had been interviewed by Channel 9.
Joy, let me ask you a little bit more about that. What would you say, because there might be people listening to your story today and being a little sceptical and thinking you're a little girl, sometimes memories can change even though we're convinced that we see a particular thing, and perhaps it was a weather balloon or some other sort of aircraft and not necessarily a UFO.
No. Definitely UFO. I'd never seen anything like it before, and we were used to seeing aircraft because we weren't that far away from Moorabbin Airport. So we would quite often see the little planes fly around. So it was nothing like I've ever seen ever since either.
So how old were you?
12 and a half.
Okay.
And how soon after you saw the flying saucers did the Army and or possibly Air Force personnel show up? How quickly did they get there?
I reckon probably 25, 30 minutes.
Right. And Shane, do you think that this could have been some kind of piece of military equipment or some other type of apparatus that's perfectly innocent?
Well, I take an agnostic view of UFOs, and this particular UFO story included, because we simply don't know. We don't know what UFOs are. But I think it's fairly obvious that it's difficult to find simply a prosaic, mundane explanation for what so many of these witnesses saw. It's easier for us to say what it wasn't. If you look at the evidence, if you sit down with the hundreds of witness testimonies, we can say fairly confidently, this obviously wasn't an aeroplane, it wasn't a helicopter, it wasn't a drone, it wasn't a kite, and I don't mean to prick anyone's balloon, but it wasn't, to me, quite obviously a meteorological balloon or anything like that. So then we're left with the mystery, what was it? Now remember, when we talk about UFO stories, it's often these days lights in the skies, people out in the outback seeing something while they're alone. This happened in broad daylight, literally hundreds of witnesses, and not only did the flying saucer fly low over 2 schools in front of all these students and local workers and residents and some teachers, it landed. It was either on the ground or close to the ground for several minutes. And in addition to that, there was this incredible response to this incident. As Joy has mentioned, police, military and more.
I understand you're a little sceptical at the start before you investigated this.
Sure.
And you seem also to be saying, you're impressing that it's an unidentified flying object, and then you're calling it a flying saucer. Do you think it's an alien craft? Do you think aliens were in there? Or are you sort of playing it safe here?
Well, I'm trying to be rational, I'm trying to be logical, I'm trying to be fair to the evidence. I often like to refer to it as a flying saucer because that's what it was called at the time. It was called that because that's what it looked like. A saucer turned upside down on another saucer or bowl. That was the shape that it presented. It was an unidentified flying object. It was seemingly a solid, metallic-looking object that flew, that nobody could identify. Now, I think that's as much as we can say, but what is really interesting is the level of response to whatever this was. And I don't know what it was, but certainly the government authorities, the Royal Australian Air Force, the Army, the Civil Defence Organisation, all responded on this day. Why did they respond, and why, in addition to that, is there no information about this incident publicly available in any of the government archives? There's some of the interesting questions.
Terry, over the years you've heard what authorities have said about this incident. How do you feel about what they say about it?
Well, look, it's hard to know. Jessica's right in a way. Over the many years our memories do change a little bit, but it is burned into my memory. I know what I saw, and no matter what anyone says, I know that it was something very unusual, and the way it took off at that speed, I doubt very much if there was anything in that day that could take off like that.
Shane, you claim you've spoken to more than 100 witnesses. Why do you think there was a cover-up? It seems at very, very high levels.
Well, that's the $94 million question, I guess. We do know that a very high-ranking public servant from the Department of Supply was dispatched to Westall that day. He investigated. And after that wonderful Australian documentary, Westall 66, A Suburban UFO Mystery, was aired on Australian television in 2010, his daughter contacted me and said, thank you for having that documentary made, because my father was there that day and he suffered for what he saw, and she and her brother, I've spoken to them both, really believe that his untimely death just 4 years later was connected with the stress that was applied to him because he tried to get answers to what happened. Why the cover-up? What could it possibly have been 50 years ago that would now be a threat to national security or anybody's reputation or any alliance with another country? Is that possible after 50 years? I think we need the answers.
So, Jackie, do you think you'll ever find out about the mystery?
No, I doubt it very much. Initially, I would have said it was some sort of test aircraft. I fell in line with that theory. But there's never been an aircraft, to my knowledge, today that can do what that did. So,
sorry, I had a question for you, but I just think, are Are you glad to have been able to speak out about this after so long? Do you feel relief?
No, not really. I think the experience actually contributed to my demeanour as an adult, the way that I handle situations and the way that I respond in a critical situation in particular. So the bullying that I underwent with those men that came to the school, which was definitely bullying now, has made me more resolved in the way I've lived my life.
Is that the same for all of you?
Yes and no. I think I've gone a little bit the opposite, where I've become more outspoken, and I don't take people's criticism and trying to tell me that I was crazy, because I know what I saw. So nothing will change my resolve. It's in my brain forever.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and your stories with us this morning. We really appreciate it. Joy Clark and Terry Peck in Melbourne, Jackie Argent in Brisbane and Shane Ryan in Canberra. We genuinely really appreciate your time and for sharing your stories. Thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Another strange tale involving a UFO, or UAP, that was witnessed near a school took place in 1977 at Broadhaven Primary School in Pembrokeshire, Wales, and it was actually one of several sightings in that area, all within the same year. In fact, the area of Broadhaven made its name known by becoming a prime spot for UFO sightings. It was dubbed the name Broadhaven Triangle after the Bermuda Triangle, following an article written in The Sun titled Spaceman Mystery of the Terror Triangle. On February 4th, 1977, it was reported that 14 schoolchildren saw a UFO craft in the field beside their school. The children ran excitedly into their school and told their teacher that they had seen a silver-suited spaceman coming out of a spaceship. Perhaps not surprisingly, their teacher didn't believe them and carried on with the lessons as normal. Upon getting out of school, however, they claimed that they saw the spaceship again. They told friends, parents, and everyone they could think of, but no one in the grown-up world would take them seriously. The next day, so miffed were they by this inattention that they handed in a petition to the police, demanding that the incident be investigated properly. All the fuss caused the headmaster to take the UFO sighting a little more seriously than he had before. He gathered all the children involved in the incident together and asked them to draw what they had seen. The drawings that resulted were highly consistent, showing a saucer-shaped UFO with a dome on top. On Monday the 7th, John Craven's News Round on BBC One ran a short piece regarding the sighting, in which Craven briefly interviewed the school's headmaster. Here is that audio.
An investigation has begun into a claim that something strange came out of the skies and landed in the Welsh village of Broadhaven near Haverfordwest. Whatever it was spotted 3 times by children from the local school, and now their reports are being investigated by the British Unidentified Flying Objects Research Association. Now, the children say the object had a large dome, it was cigar-shaped, and was silver in colour. Well, to find out more, I've just been on the phone to their headmaster, Mr. Llewellyn.
I know that 16 children saw it.
And did they all see the same thing, do you think?
There's a common core of similarity between all their descriptions. I got them to draw and to write what they saw.
And do you believe it?
I believe that they saw something which is not common in the environment in which they saw it, but whether they've interpreted correctly, I wouldn't know.
Quite a mystery.
David Davies was 10 at the time and heard reports of pupils seeing flying saucers throughout the day. I was a natural-born skeptic, so after the bell rang, I decided to go out to the area that the children said they had seen it, he told BBC Wales. He described seeing a silver, cigar-shaped craft with a dome covering the middle third. My sighting only lasted a couple of seconds. It popped up and then went back behind a tree. Mr. Davies said he did not feel afraid, more in awe and wonderment, although he admitted he had a strange desire to run away. Mr. Davies described the days that followed as a wild roller coaster. It went crazy with the media, and it was difficult to settle down and actually think about what we had seen.
Well, I saw the spaceship. I didn't see the man. The spaceship, it looked a cigar shape with a dome on it. and it had a yellowy, orange to red light on the top of it.
And how clearly did you see it?
Well, I couldn't see its face because it was too far away.
Now, you say you saw a man as well, did you?
Yes.
And what about him?
Well, he was too far away to be seen as well.
My friend Philip here was trying to find a way over the stream, and I was looking at the bushes up the top of the trees, and then suddenly this silver cigar-shaped object seemed to pop up from behind the bushes and trying to take off. Then it disappeared again.
Are you sure it wasn't perhaps just a helicopter or an aircraft from the airfield near here?
A helicopter could land there, but that's private property over there. And if they landed there, they could be prosecuted. And with an aircraft, the only thing that could get in there was a Harrier.
Were you frightened at the time?
Yes.
Why?
Well, I thought there would be a whole arm inside there or something.
This first sighting heralded an extraordinary year of unusual happenings in Wales. 2 months later, Rosa Granville, who ran the Haven Fort Hotel in nearby Little Haven, described seeing an object which looked like an upside-down saucer and 2 faceless humanoid creatures with pointed heads which emerged from the UFO and walked around it for a bit as if gathering something. She said that so much heat came off of the UFO that her face felt burned. There was light coming from it and flames of all colors. Then, the creatures came out of these flames. "That's what I don't understand," she said. Mrs. Granville went to fetch other residents of the hotel to show them, but found the UFO and its mysterious occupants gone by the time she returned. When she visited the field, she said there was 2 inches of burned grounds. Somewhat distressed by the encounter, Mrs. Granville wrote a letter to her MP, who promptly asked the Ministry of Defense to investigate. As a result, Mrs. Granville received a visit from an RAF officer who listened to her story and professed himself mystified by it all. Mrs. Granville said the incident left her agitated and disturbed. As these events unfolded, vast numbers of people claimed to see UFOs or to have bizarre paranormal experiences of other kinds. One family in particular was severely affected by it all. The Coombs family, who were employed by the Ripperston farm, had a number of very strange experiences. Among these were sightings of UFOs from their car, a 7-foot silver-suited being with a black visor appearing outside their window, constant mechanical disturbances, including their car and television set repeatedly breaking down and having to be replaced, and their cows seemingly being teleported from one field to another. To mark the 40-year anniversary since the sightings, a conference was held in Broadhaven, organized by the Swansea UFO Network. Several of the eyewitnesses of the Broadhaven sighting spoke at the conference, one of which was David Davies. A link to the full video can be found in the show notes, but here is a portion of what he had to say.
4th of February 1977. Anybody who was in the area yesterday will appreciate the weather that we had on that particular day. It was abysmal. Never being one who's been a great lover of being cold and wet, I wasn't out that day with the rest of the children while they were playing football. I much preferred to stay in the classroom, reading, doing my own work. Not at that point, no. Throughout the day, the children would be coming in from the playground during break times and reporting that they'd seen something strange in the playing field surrounding the school. I've always been a natural-born skeptic. I don't do belief systems, I don't believe in things. I either know or I don't know, simple as that. And one thing that I was pretty sure of at the time was that flying saucers didn't exist. I had a long fascination with science fiction. However, the sort of science fiction that deals with humanity's place in the future, etc. Nothing to do with spaceships coming from Mars and invading, nothing at all like that. So, being the natural-born skeptic that I was, at the end of the day, I decided that I was going to debunk this once and for all. Total nonsense. So at the end of the day, when the final bell went, I walked to the top of the playing field, which you'll see when you go over there later. and there was absolutely nothing in sight. It was drizzling like mad, wind, horrible. But despite this, and despite the fact that it was a bit of a quagmire, I thought I wasn't going to get this debunked properly unless I actually got to the location where the children had said they'd seen something. So, despite it being a little bit against the school rules, I thought I'd make my way over the fence of the perimeter of the school and cross a small stream. Well, I'd only managed to get my leg over when I was suddenly drawn to a large object which had appeared from behind a group of trees, which are still there. About 45 feet long, silver, an expression I didn't use at the time because it wasn't in my vocabulary, but the silver finish had a pearlescent sort of feel to it. It was almost difficult to focus on, but a sort of mother of pearl effect. It had a central dome that covered the top third, the middle third of the vehicle, and a red, I described it at the time as a flashing light. Now, again, another word that wasn't in my vocabulary at the same time, and I'll correct that now. I would say it was pulsating more than flashing. Rather than a flash like you'd see on an emergency vehicle, it was more sort of a very slow, perhaps one flash per second pulsation. I honestly couldn't believe what I saw, and the sighting only lasted for the matter of about 10 seconds at the very most. And the object, virtually motionless, but it appeared to be giving a slight tugging motion away from the trees, and then went behind the trees again. Now, for some reason, my natural curiosity, let me point out at this time, there was no fear at all in this sighting. It was pure amazement at this thing that was in front of me. But one thing I've never been able to explain since, and to me it's more important than the actual sighting itself. 5 to 10 seconds of a sighting, it's memorable, but there was also a psychological aspect as well, because I found myself running away from where I'd seen it. As I said, there's no fear at all, and to this day I can't explain why I felt the urge to run away. But the speed at which I moved, it was almost as if my life depended on it, and I keep thinking about this time and time again over the last 40 years. And the only thing I can think of is that some sort of suggestion was put there that I had to get away. Anyway, I got in the taxi that we had to take us home from school, and got home. My mother realised I was very agitated. I think she described it more as frightened, but it wasn't frightened. It was literally agitated with what I'd seen, and the fact that I'd had my world turned up on end, because to me these things didn't exist. You heard Randall Jones-Pugh being mentioned in the talk. Randall Jones-Pugh had recently retired as the local vet for the area, and living on a farm. We knew him very well, or at least my mother did, so she got in touch with him knowing of the interest that he had in UFOs. So Randall appeared quite quickly, and later on that night we came back down to the school, probably about 6 or 7 o'clock in the evening. But by that time it was totally impossible to get to where we'd seen it. It was a quagmire, and the light had gone completely. So we came down the following morning with a reporter from the Western Telegraph called Hugh Turnbull, and managed to get to the spot where the object had appeared. There was no evidence that any other vehicle had been involved. Like I said, the area was an absolute quagmire, and subsequent investigations with Welsh Water, who own a sewage treatment works just further up the hill, and the local farmers revealed that no vehicles of any type had been in that area on the day, or for any time previous to that day. So a little bit of further investigation revealed that near the site, the only physical evidence which could be taken that there was something to what we had seen was that a recently erected and repaired telegraph pole, the cross-section, which had been put up only a few days earlier, had been knocked to an angle like that. From then, it just went crazy. The school erupted into a media circus, the likes of which Pembrokeshire has probably never seen. It's certainly, our headmaster had certainly never seen anything like it, because he got to the point in the end where he left the phone off the hook and decided to put an end to this once and for all. But in that time, we'd attracted media attention from all around the world. There were even rumours of going over to the States to film a documentary, which of course never transpired. Now, 40 years on, over the last 40 years, I've always been referred to as the boy that saw the spaceship. I have never at any time in the last 40 years, not then, not now, ever claimed that I saw a spaceship. I saw a UFO. It was a flying object, it was unidentified. That's simple as that. If there is a terrestrial explanation for this UFO, I'm quite willing to accept that. But after 40 years of research and thousands of pounds spent on literature, various other work, I am still none the wiser to what we saw. I could go into the little details of how the theories of how these craft are powered, how they fly, but with regards to the origin of these craft, nobody knows.
Some skeptics have claimed that the entire Broadhaven UFO flap was caused by hoaxers. It was noted that silver suits, somewhat resembling those described by the eyewitnesses, were in use at a nearby oil refinery. As happens in almost all cases of persistent UFO activity in a specific area, hoaxing does soon enter the picture. There is a temptation to dismiss all of the incidents because of a few fake ones, but it's difficult to see how hoaxers could account for all of the flying objects that were sighted. The Broadhaven UFO flap was one of the most important in British history, and the strange events there, which elicited interest from journalists and researchers throughout the country, have still never been satisfactorily explained. If you or someone that you know has witnessed something unexplainable, and you'd like to have your story shared on the podcast, please contact me at paranormalmysteriespodcast@gmail.com or visit paranormalmysteriespodcast.com and click on the Tell Your Story link. Please remember, no matter how insignificant or outlandish you believe your experience may seem, I'd like to hear about it. You can also connect with us by joining our forum and by following us on social media. All of our contact information, as well as the sources referenced in today's episode, can be found in the show notes. If you'd like to support the podcast, please subscribe to the show and share it with your friends. If you'd like to become a patron, visit patreon.com/paranormal mysteries. Benefits include ad-free episodes and early access to select shows. Or, if you'd like to make a simple one-time donation, please visit buymeacoffee.com/paranormal. However you choose to support the show, just know that we appreciate it. New episodes of the Paranormal Mysteries podcast are produced every Sunday, with the new midweek mysteries airing every Wednesday, and they're available on all of your favorite podcast apps. From all of us at the Paranormal Mysteries podcast, thank you for listening, and remember, don't wait for the unknown to come to you. Get out there and find it.